Hello, hello. I am Janet Raftis, and I am here today with a friend and colleague of mine, Jay Greathouse, who we had offices in the same office space up until recently. And she's just been a really bright light and somebody that I respect and admire a lot. And the nuances, and sometimes the not even nuances, but what should be over the head sledgehammers of cultural appropriation and everything that and how it impacts my work with the divine feminine and in the spiritual community. And as a healer, it's been on my mind a lot that there's a lot I don't understand and a lot I need to really step into. And I feel like for those of us who are white and privileged, this is a really important conversation to have. And so I'm really grateful to you, Jay, for being here with us. And I would love for you just to introduce yourself and we can start.
Yeah. Thank you. It's so good to be here with you. What's really exciting about this, Janet, is that we had already been talking about this topic for a while. Yeah. And so I really appreciate the way that it kind of naturally came back together after things. There were other pressing matters that just needed bandwidth. But this has already been something on your heart and something that we wanted to check in about. So I just want to name that and how beautiful it is when we just kind of listen to spirit and allow things to unfold, not only on our own timelines, but in the larger context. So thank you for that. So hi, everyone. I'm Jay. As Janet mentions, I am, we shared space at the center for a while, and it was really beautiful, and are all prepared to transition now and continue offering our gifts in different ways. I am traditionally trained as a licensed therapist and also integrate intuitive healing work. I do energy work, intuitive guidance into my holistic clinical therapy practice. And so that's kind of how I show up in space right now. Right now, everything's virtual, but working with it. So, a lot of my work centers Black, Indigenous, people of color, LGBTQ plus community, empaths, women of color, and those who are just naturally drawn to me. So I don't work exclusively with those groups, but I do center them and make sure that I'm able to decrease barriers as much as possible. So thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. So I love how you just said that those are the groups that you center. And I think that that's a great starting point for cultural appropriation, right? Because from my sort of understanding of it, right, is that we decentered, we marginalized, we pushed all of this out. And then now we're stepping in and going like, oh, hey, this is super cool. Right. Mm-hmm. So how do you perceive cultural appropriation? How does it impact you? How does it impact your community? What's your definition and what are like your feelings around it too?
Yeah, Janet, you just asked me like 20 questions.
Sorry.
Well, there's a whole program right there, everyone. That's great. No, I feel it also. I'll just kind of speak from whatever comes now. My sense of cultural appropriation, and what I want to also name, you mentioned privileges earlier, and white people who are privileged and naming privileges. And I also want to name that many of us are walking with multiple privileges. We have a privileged self and a subjugated self. And as a Black queer woman, I also held various privileges that I have to name. I have to name those, whether it's socioeconomic, education background, access to resources, even my ability to, have a practice and offer. Those are ways that I have access to different resources that maybe other people don't. And so I do want to name that even as someone who is a part of marginalized communities and communities that are subjugated at times, I also hold privilege. And sometimes that can be a really tricky place to arrive in, how to like see it all. So for me, I have to also acknowledge that I have been, I have used cultural appropriation in the past, absolutely. And a part of my own knowledge, awareness, awakening, humbling of my heart and my journey, I've had to accept that and name that and make some shifts and adjustments into my own practice. So for me, essentially, it's taking the thing and discarding the person, kind of, taking the practice without the people. Or, there's a quote that was going around about people loving Black culture, but not Black people. So there's parts of the culture that are fun and exciting and powerful, but you want the power without the pain that has kind of maybe birthed or generated some of the practices. And we can share more about that later. I was talking to you specifically, my ancestry and lineage is traced back to Africa, yet my ancestors that I do know of are African Americans. They were enslaved people here in the United States. And so that's kind of where our oral and written tradition was started. I don't really have a connection back to the continent, the homeland in which my people came from. So even I have to be aware of that. And I've been made more conscious of that as I built community with Black people who are from the continent. So Africans who are living in America, and even acknowledging how our experiences are different. Something that comes to me are patterns. A really great example. There's so many different patterns that come from different regions of Africa. Africa is huge, and there's different patterns that have different meanings or different ceremonies. And even within the Black community, that has been a conversation around headscarves and head ties and wearing things without the meaning. So even myself as a Black person, I have to be aware of what I'm taking from my own larger culture, and being aware of the meaning, the purpose, the sacredness of those practices. And without doing education or building organic community, it's lost. So I think that's kind of what it feels like to me. It's like, oh, let me try this on. Oh, it's kind of like using people's practices on trend for your own benefit. For your own profit, without uplifting, contributing back to, and nourishing in which you're taking from. It's a very one-sided dynamic.
Right. So, and something that kind of occurs to me is that for those of us with privilege, the more privilege we have, the more, I think, compounded this would be, right? Is that I can, as a woman with privilege, I can give or take whatever I want, whenever I want, as it suits me, right? Like if I want to wear an African headscarf one day, then I can do that. And then I can, do, the Indian practices the next day, and I could, right? Without thinking about it, right? Yeah. Just like, oh, this is fun, or that's not fun anymore, right? So it's very detached and depersonalized.
Yes.
Yeah.
You got it.
You said something that you said, your ancestry here in the States is traced back to enslavement, right? And so something I've been reading that book, I just started it, My Grandmother's Hands by Resna.
Oh, yeah.
And I've done a lot of nervous system work. I've studied nervous system trauma and all of that. And so it's really landing with me very powerfully how he talks about how our bodies, white bodies, Black bodies, right, indigenous bodies, are programmed, right, with the trauma. So if your ancestors came from Africa, they got here, they were enslaved, greatly traumatized, abused, right? So all of that abuse is being encoded in their system. And then on top of that, they're being told they can't worship the way they worshiped, they can't speak the way they spoke, they can't have their tradition. So all of that gets really ingrained in the nervous system, right? It's like, becomes this trauma that even if you don't have, as you living in 2020, don't have specific examples of what the customs were, or like you have the trauma encoded in your body. So there's a reaction, even if you don't really know what the reaction is.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And that's something we were talking about before we got on, is that that's something that even, and we can expand the conversation beyond, Black people, but that's the experience that I've lived. So that's the one in which I'm able to speak mostly to. But I'm also aware of how similar things have happened through various assimilation process. So whether it's, people's generations who have immigrated over and sever their native tongue, sever the, mother language that they were told, because they don't want their kids to have an accent. They don't want their kids to, seem as if English is a second language. And so you're absolutely right. Those intergenerational traumas stay encoded in our system. So even if, let's say, you're sharing space with someone and you're walking in with your, African garb or the, Indian God that you're wanting to talk about and share, that, yes, sometimes people will have very strong reactions to that and not even know why. And it definitely goes back to what you mentioned, if we were particularly African Americans whose ancestors were enslaved in this country, it was illegal to practice the natural and indigenous ways of worship, the natural and indigenous spiritual practices that have been before even coming here, and they were made illegal, demonized, and now all of a sudden someone's coming back. And I know we worked with, was it Oya? And one of so, Yoruba, Ifa, a lot of these practices are a lot more Santeria, are a lot more visible now because they can be, but they weren't always that way. And it's not like we just decided to hide it for fun. There were reasons, survival tactics, and that's something else that comes up as a really big charge that I think is very relevant right now as we are witnessing the mass movement, the racial revolution, things that are just spot in our face that we can't ignore. When we hear people that have sentiments of like, well, I'm spiritual, I'm not political. And again, let me name, I don't watch the news. I don't track the news. My system is uber sensitive to information, yet I have to stay informed. And I have to stay informed not only to hold space for my clients who are grieving and experiencing trauma every day, but also for survival.
Yeah.
I didn't know about a curfew and people who were being harmed for being out after a curfew, until a friend said, wait, what are you doing? Where are you going? I have to know these things to survive as a Black body person of color. And these are the ways in which our spiritual practices, I don't know if anyone on this live has seen Harriet, but I really loved how that movie amplified Harriet Tubman's spiritual gifts and what had been referred to as seizures, epileptic seizures on her journeys to and from freeing slaves. In the most recent rendition of Harriet, they spoke to it as her messages from God, her downloads from God. Yes. Yes. So it's like these were things, downloads, channeling, receiving messages that were already there. Now, could she go and tell everybody that? Oh,
yeah.
Because of the conditioning, because of the, enslaved brain and the ways in which we had to navigate things to survive. Right. So now as we see this racial revolution happening, you have to be aware of how much of these things are coming up again. And it's not just a political conversation. It's literally, if you were birthed into certain bodies, you were born politicized, just in existence.
Yeah, you're conceived in that.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and we have a couple of questions coming up that we'll get to in just a little bit. But I want to speak to that for just a moment because, in the spiritual community, I think it's really easy to be like, well, I've had a past life as a Black person, or I've had, and a lot of us have, and Black people have had past lives as white people, right? It's the body that we're in right now that is speaking to us, that is informing our lives, right? That is working out the trauma, right? And so we have to be very cognizant of sort of like, okay, we can honor that we've all had past lives and they've had these, experiences, and that is affecting us, sure. But in these bodies right now, how can we take care of the other bodies that we're sharing the planet with?
Wow, that's beautiful. I love that. Yeah, and that was one of the things that I had in my notes. I've heard that several times, and I don't know why. In my experience, it's mostly white presenting people saying I was Native American in my past life. So I don't know if there's like some sort of relevance to that. I don't know, but I've heard that often, and for some reason, it always raises my awareness, and I enjoy curiosity, right? Yeah. If that is what you feel, that's great. And exactly what you said, Janet, how are you showing up for your local tribes? How are you showing up and building community with your local relationships here and now, versus just saying that, meaning you have access to all these practices because in a past life, that's who you are. That could be exactly what you said. I get downloads all the time. And I think this is going to lead us eventually into Matt's question. I get downloads and information from places people like I don't know, so I get it. Some of the things that I'm drawn to, they are not directly from my lineage.
Right.
And I'm open to that, but I also do research. I educate myself. I naturally develop relationships with people outside of just my reflections. Right. And that tends to lead me, hey, do you know someone who practices so-and-so? Hey, do you know someone who has more connection in real time with this symbol or this, object or this practice? Even with my Reiki training, I was attuned by a beautiful, beautiful sensei named Marie in Oakland. And I had hesitancy on becoming a master teacher. Mm-hmm. I felt for whatever reason, it wasn't my initiation to train. And we had many conversations about it, about appropriation, about how it felt. And I still don't necessarily feel called to train, yet I still practice. What I have realized that there's a whole energetic system in which I do have access to, and that was the foundation. And I give credit to Marie and her Japanese lineage, and even recognition of that even within the Japanese culture, if it's the Usui lineage, is still controversial. There are many people with Japanese lineage that, again, specifically talking about Reiki from the Usui lineage, that don't recognize it or don't feel like it's a valid form of practice. And so even I knowing that and being called in by people with Japanese heritage who said, that word Reiki actually brings up a lot for me. Right. It brings up a lot and I don't actually resonate with it. Wow. And so having humility enough to know that was the practice that I was drawn to, yet it doesn't mean that I own it.
Right. Right. I love that. That's really great. And, and honestly, I hadn't even thought about it in terms of Reiki, right? And I am a Reiki master and I do teach. And I love that. Like, how can I, and I'm not really teaching Reiki anymore, but, taking this into consideration now, if I were and for those of you who are watching who are Reiki masters, is like, how can we incorporate honoring more tradition or even having this conversation in the classroom, right? Of like what this means and how can we honor it in a way and respect it? And I think that's one of the questions that we have coming up here. And Matt is asking, how do you go about acknowledging the appropriation in a constructive way when perhaps confronted with something you were unaware of the origins or significance?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Janet, do you have, can you break that down a little more for me? It's a lot of words for this.
Yeah.
It's a good question though.
Yeah, I think it's like, how can we, when we are when we are made aware of something like this. So becoming aware of Reiki, right? Or of Oya, like being like, wait a minute, maybe I shouldn't just, have the circle on Oya. What is it that then, like, I know what I did, right? Is I researched it, and I looked into nonprofits that were based in Nigeria that were helping women who were aligned with the teachings of Oya, right? Yeah. And then I made a financial donation to that. So that was one way. But I'm curious to know if you have, any thoughts. Like, I think it's so important. It would be easy for us to get wrapped up in, I didn't know, blah, 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 right? Go down that rabbit hole. Or even to get caught up in white fragility, which is, we should probably address that separately in a minute. But just what can we do to be better when we're made aware of this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think what you modeled is a really great example. There's a lot of things we aren't going to know. We're on this in this human vessel, and we're learning every single day. And again, when we come from a place of curiosity and openness, I think we're able to be receptive to those things in which we don't know, and also be accountable for the fact that we live in a world saturated with resource and access right now. So again, if your community and your practices and your clients are only reflective of a very homogenized group, yet all of your practices are eclectic and international and global, to me, that is a deeper question for you to sit with for yourself.
Gotcha. Yeah.
I think there's some incongruency there. Mm-hmm. If you, for whatever reason, are not able to, in your whole contact directory, to reach out to someone who could connect you with someone and someone else, but yet you have this wealth of information, wealth of knowledge and resources that you've been able to purchase and attain through your own ease, privilege, access, and exchange. And that's really goes back to the heart of appropriation, taking something that, was birthed in a different origin, cultural origin, and profiting off of it without any connection or any, I love the fact that you found local resources in which, the practice was birthed to contribute to. Mm-hmm. And over time, you might find opportunities, Janet, to actually engage with that organization on a more personal level. They might have a call for, volunteers or, Zoom calls, who knows? But that's how that's how I have found it's helpful to move outside the box. Something I wanted to name here with this research that we keep saying, also acknowledging that many, many, many cultures, especially in the spiritual realms, didn't necessarily have written traditions. A lot of it was oral. A lot of it was experiential. And that's still embedded in the way that, a lot of communities I engage with practice. Mm-hmm. And so that's why building relationship is often valued over items, materials, or things. So that's how we see you can take a Tibetan singing bowl, but have no idea or information or true connection with anyone that has a more authentic or organic relationship with that item, because we just purchased the item off the shelf and that's that.
Right.
It can be as simple as knowing the actual that you're supporting a authentic, let's say, Navajo artist versus buying a Navajo inspired piece from World Market. Right. Knowing where your money's going, just putting that extra effort in really starts to disrupt that. So the training part of research, I think meditation is a really great example of this. Mm-hmm. Many people know things intuitively. If you're of the earth, if you have connection with your intuition, source, nature, you don't need a westernized doctor with a scientific study and stats to tell you that meditation helps with your overall health. We just knew it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But this need to have things in a very analytical and factual way, I do feel like that is typically a westernized, white-centered model of validation, and that goes back to appropriation, privilege, access, and resources.
Yeah, absolutely. So you touched on something that I would love to go a little deeper into, and that is, you didn't say erasure, but it was sort of implied, I think, in what you were saying. So how do we, if somebody, so I have clients who are Black, who are Indian, who are, have some sort of Native blood in them, typically South American. And to me, it's really important that I don't just, so thinking about my work with the Divine Feminine and the women's circles I do, that I don't just work with white goddesses, right? Like, it's important, I think, that everybody see themselves reflected in the divine, right? And so how can we, and I think we've touched on this to some extent already, but how can we be cognizant of the idea of erasure, or not, and not contributing to erasure, while also, making sure that we're doing this very sincerely.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, again, I think a really great start with that is being curious with yourself. So like when Oya came to you, I believe you said you sat with the card, you sat with the inspiration, the connection. And I think that's really important to even know the why. Why am I fascinated and drawn to all, Navajo designs? Why am I specifically wanting to explore, Southeast Asian emotional mental health practices? These things are important. And the question starts with deeper reflection. Is it a trend? Is it because that's the latest certification? Is it because you want to present as if you are, inclusive and diverse? But I think starting with your why and doing some internal reflections and opening to that can really lead us to our next steps. So when things come to me, it's like you said, how to honor a diverse and expressive place. I think the why to me leads back to a place of authenticity. So example, again, going back to the formal Japanese Reiki, that was a calling. That was a nudge. I felt led to do that. And then I had one certification with a white woman who was leading the level 1 training. It didn't land for me. It didn't connect. And I didn't even know it wasn't going to connect until I went.
Right.
And so representation, I'm trying to get back to your question. So representation and wanting to be inclusive, I then sought out something else. Right. But without the why, like I knew that for me, Reiki wasn't just a certification. I knew it wasn't something I just wanted to put on a website, but I had to know that that wasn't matched for me. So I then sought out someone else who had a more spiritual and fluid relationship with their Reiki practice. And that ended up being my Reiki sensei. And she was Japanese. So I think but it continues to unfold. I didn't stop there. Now I have integrated other practices that are more Afrocentric into my energy practice, which is why I call it energy work and not just Reiki. Yeah. And so there's the Kemetic lineage of Reiki as well, and energy work that stems from Egypt and Africa, different parts of Africa. And that led me back to myself. So I think wanting to be inclusive of others also is a nudge to go within and ask, what part of me is wanting to connect with this expression? So you can allow yourself to, have that diverse representation of goddess, and also your why led you to further research, further information, finding the local group. And I think that is the importance. That's a really great start.
Yeah.
I don't think we need to go around collecting people as, plugs. Like, well, I can use this now because, I found the one Cherokee guru in the area that's gonna put a stamp of approval on this practice. I don't think that's authentic either.
Mm-hmm.
But the curiosity allows us to be more expansive.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I love what you just said. I think we have to be really careful about not tokenizing. I think that is something that white people that we might have a tendency towards, right? In our fragility, right?
Yeah.
And I think this is something that I've noticed a lot as this conversation has deepened so much over the last month, right? And which is fantastic. It's so good. And one of the things that I notice in general, right, is the concept of white fragility. And it's something that I notice in the spiritual community, right? So there's, and it's connected to our privilege. And so, and I want to be completely transparent here. I have experienced myself experiencing white fragility before, right? Like where I've been in my head, not all white people, and I'm not like that, right? Like this is something that I'm having it's an internal process for me too, right? And one that I continue to work with and do healing around and reset all the things, right? Listening to people of color so that I can really take it in and feel it in my body and notice what's coming up, right? But I'm noticing that there's a lot of I'm not like that. I wouldn't do that. I don't feel that way. It's okay for me to, and I think, and I don't want to judge or blame, right? It's at the same time as like how can we cultivate more awareness around that, right? And also we're going to make mistakes. You alluded to this earlier. And that is how we learn. We learn by making mistakes, by putting our foot in our mouths and by doing the wrong thing. So honoring that. But also, being able to, as white people, we shouldn't have to be coddled. We should not be coddled. Like there needs to be some directness and we need to kind of step into that.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think it takes these conversations, what is the difference between collaboration and tokenizing, right? Like for me, to even be able to have this conversation, you would have had to check some of your white fragility. You just would have to. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to get to the next level. And it doesn't mean that you're a bad person or you've done something wrong. It means there's continued work to be done. We're all expanding. And if we truly want to meet on that universal oneness, that universal intelligence and the connection at the heart, we simply have to acknowledge that we were birthed into this time, space, reality in different forms.
Right.
We just were. And we as human beings also created the rules. Yeah. We were participating in various agreements that were created in this time. And we also get to break, change, and disrupt the rules. But if you are so caught in the I'm not me, I'm different, I'm a good one, I'm a good person, look what I did, if you're so caught in that you can't actually drop into like the deeper conversation, like what we're having, then you're going to continue to repel the actual, humility and truth that can help you break into that true authentic oneness.
Right. I love that you just brought that up like that. It's like, I think it's really easy to also spiritually bypass, right? We're one. It's great. And we're all one, right? And also we're here on the planet in these physical bodies dealing with very real trauma and marginalization and racism and bad practices. And we're here to grow and cultivate that. And we can't get to true oneness unless we actually go through that.
Yeah, we have to go through it. And if someone is coming to you saying, ouch, this is really big. Like when I attended the circle with Oya, if I came back to you and said, that felt really weird, like that didn't land for me, I trust that you would have received that and you would have said, oh, Tell me more. Because the difference to me between, we're going back to relationship, the different in seeing people. Now we're back to appropriation. You see the practice. So Oya was not only a card, not only a goddess to go on your circle. In your circle, Oya came with all of her history, all of her origin, all of her energy, and you truly connected with that. Otherwise, you could have simply cut that off. And so, to me, what looks different is the relationship piece. Outside of the circle, before this talk, checking, asking how I'm doing, exchanging thoughts. It was a development, not just you simply wanting to gain something from me, which would have been a one-sided exchange.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Thank you. Matt says it's like Mary Poppins' bag. We'll never end up unpacking it all. It's ongoing. and that's so true, right? There's always going to be another level for us to drop into. I'll be like, oh my God, I get it. And then I'm like,
here's more.
Totally.
Level 10, are you ready?
Yeah, totally. So, what are some things that we can do? We've mentioned some over the course of this, but what are some things that we can do, as white people? So let's say that we're in a shop and we're like looking at that Tibetan bowl and we're like, oh, that's really cool. And I heard my Reiki master played it in a session I had with her and I'm going to get it, right? Or God, even with some more common stuff, saging, right? Like
I have that in my notes. Sage, yeah. That's a big one.
It is. So what are some things that we can do to support and uphold those communities and to really get to that deeper place with it? I mean, we've mentioned a lot of it, but just to kind of recap and maybe if there's anything else coming up around it.
Yeah. I also want to clarify, Janet, I don't feel like it's on me to tell white people what to do. I think that's for white people to have that conversation on what they need to do. I feel like, having collaborative exchanges and I can share my experience absolutely of what feels helpful and what, if it's coming from a place of wanting to learn and someone's wanting to listen, I can share my perspective, right? But as far as, some of the work, and this is something that I put in my notes, was find your own cultural beliefs. Like so often in shared spaces, I've heard, white peers say, I just feel like we don't have any culture and I don't have any, practices. So there's almost like this endless void of like taking from other people's practices because there's this blanketed statement that like, there's nothing unique about the white, I'm just going to say the white American experience. I can't speak to, elsewhere. But there's work to be done. Just like, I took steps to reconnect with my own African lineage that was intentionally severed, that was intentionally cut off. Like I said, the ancestors that I know were birthed in the United States. They were birthed in, Alabama, Mississippi. That's where they come from. That's where my folks come from. And I had to do work to reconnect with that. I had to do work to learn who we were before we arrived to this country. And there's still there's still gaps. Right. And I'm still not owning, although, AfricanAncestry.com says, my lineage is from Nigeria and Ghana. I'm not going around saying I'm Nigerian and, Ghanaian. That's not my lived experience, but I can honor it. I can build a connection with it. I can say, oh, that's why I'm drawn to Yoruba. That's why I'm drawn to certain Orishas, because of some of those practices that were handed down. So it does help. So I would say first and foremost, make sure you're doing your own work on your family of origins, the practices that might have already been there, so that it can help you kind of have that connection when you're building your practice with other people's culture as well. Mm-hmm. I'm often drawn to songs and I don't even know the language. You know, I get it. Like, I get it when we say there's stuff that that are just, you know, in us, it's birthed us, and I don't know the language, but I try to find out where it's coming from, and I'm very intentional on how I share it. I'm very intentional on when I play it. I don't take it as mine to then mass produce or resell. So I would say first check in with your own practices. Ask yourself why you are connected to that thing in that moment. Ask for guidance, ask for next steps. And I think that can open up a lot. Go to the source, connect with local communities that have similar practices, similar representations. I read somewhere, and I want to share these two resources at the end of, I'm not, this is not my specialty. Social justice, you know, activism. It's something that I integrate into my being, just as a like I said, a Black queer woman navigating this earth. And I do hold that lens, but there are people who do this work day in and day out. So I do want to share two resources at the end of our chat that can help people go even deeper into this. And they, Aorta was one of the organizations. They had some really powerful reflective questions on cultural appropriation versus appreciation. And I think that could be a really great next step. I think the other thing I would share is there's a lot of people already doing what you're doing. So if you feel called to replicate a sweat lodge or a healing circle that has a certain feel to it, I think we see this a lot in the yogi community, unfortunately. If your yoga studio only has white instructors, white clients, white, it's very white centered, I think that's problematic for most people.
Right.
It's incongruent to the origin of the practice. So it's just a question of why. What are you doing to actually be inclusive? What is your marketing? You know, who are you speaking to? And I understand we all have people who are drawn to us for whatever reason. That's okay. But we also have, you know, fine tuning that can happen. Like I said, I center certain communities that are near and dear to my heart, but I also know energetically there are white people who are drawn to me. There are, you know, cisgendered men that I work with because for whatever reason, my work resonates with them, and I drop in and I listen to spirit and I allow that to guide our work. But does that mean that, you know, I'm also putting in a lot of work to make sure that I'm accessible and have space and capacity for communities that don't always get this type of access? Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. There's some really good points that you made there. And I thought when you were speaking, one thing that popped up for me was you mentioned going to the source. And, you know, one thing, I mean, it's great, obviously, going to the source because then you're supporting that community financially, right? So if you buy a Guatemalan handbag from somebody who actually lives in Guatemala and who is making those Guatemalan handbags, right? Then that is really a very direct support versus somebody who is manufacturing fake Guatemalan handbags that might look cool, and they might be less expensive, right? But they weren't actually made there. But not only are you financially supporting, but oftentimes you get the story with it. You hear about the village that it came from and the woman or the community of women that made it, or, you know, whatever. There's this information that goes along with it, right? That can enrich the experience. And I think that's something that I just, you know, for me being even more aware of that, it's really easy for us sometimes to head to a Target or even a World Market. World Market has stuff from all over the world, right? But it's mostly mass manufactured stuff, right? So how can we have that deeper awareness and think, you know, God, I really love, you know, X, and I really love this type of jewelry, right? That, you know, these earrings, you know, and they look very, you know, tribal. Right? Well, what tribe are they from? Where are they coming from? What are the materials? Who's making them? Right? These are all questions that we can take a lot deeper.
And why are you drawn to tribal earrings? That is the question.
Right.
I ask myself these things. There are certain, the kind of the Southeast Asian or either Eastern Asian artwork that we often see in Buddhist-inspired communities, having the headpieces on the walls. And at one point, someone told me that that's actually not. That's actually like in some communities dishonoring in various elements. And so now there's things that I have adjusted in my own practice. I'm very, very particular about what I'm drawn to, why, and how I display it in my home. I am constantly, I love the way that moccasins look and feel. Right. They're comfortable. They feel good. I no longer, unless someone who made the moccasins, who has a connection with their origin, unless they gifted them to me, I would probably not wear them. It has to be a really connected and genuine act in order to represent that. And some people have very eclectic communities. They're getting these gifts from people who are making them. Right. And I hope that they're sharing the knowledge. I hope that they're sharing their experience, like you said, the stories. Let the oral tradition go on in you. Be a sharer, a storyteller, an amplifier of the communities in which you are feeling drawn to in some ways. Don't let it stop with the item.
Yeah, I love that. That's really beautiful. And I think, that speaks to cultural appreciation versus appropriation, but it speaks to a bigger thing of what's going on right now is, right, we need to elevate voices of people of color. We need to elevate voices of the Black community. We need to actually listen to them. And that is the bigger picture of what, cultural appropriation falls under that umbrella, right? It really, what it comes down to is us not listening, right? And not engaging and just, cruising through it, And so as white people, or even as other people of color who have different experiences, like you were saying, with Native American traditions or with Asian traditions, it's to open ourselves. And this is just what I'm, sort of processing as you speak, is like us taking that to a much deeper level and really listening, really listening to the people who are speaking so that we're hearing them. Right? And making the time to listen so that we can hear these different perspectives, because then we will have a deeper understanding. Then it will become more ingrained within us to even think about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's consistent. It's something, it's not a one-time deal. It's a mindset shift. It's a lifestyle shift. It's a way of embodying the practice, the very practices that you are offering. It's actually embodying that. And it's just, a gentle check of our first inclinations. And again, going back to that, by getting past that fragility, getting past the need to protect your rightness. I'm right because
goodness.
Yeah.
People are really invested in being good while doing, things that are very contrary to that.
Yes. So listening is huge. And again, that goes back to valuing the people. Oh no, I need to grab my charger really quick. Valuing the people attached to the practices as much as you are valuing the practice, because that yields to the ability to drop in and listen. Of course, you're going to listen to someone who you find valuable.
Right. Yeah.
Which I hope would be most all humans. That's the goal.
That's right. So we just have a few minutes left. I just wanted to check in with those who are watching with us and who are engaging in this to see if anybody has any other questions while we kind of continue. I'll just give you all a minute to put those in there if you have them. And even if you're watching later, come back and Jay will not be involved in the comments afterwards, but I will be. And I will do my best to direct you in the right direction if I can.
Where can I put those resources, Janet?
Let's see. Do you see, I don't know how this works, how the SteamYard works. Do you have access to the comment thread?
Yes.
Go ahead and put them right in there.
Okay.
That is great. Thank you. Mm-hmm. This has been a really beautiful conversation. I'm really grateful for it. I knew that it would take it even deeper for me, which, you know, I'm really wanting to do that, even when it's uncomfortable, you know.
Yeah.
Especially when it's uncomfortable, right? Like I think this is something that, you know, we can just touch on a little bit here, is that when there's discomfort, that's the greatest opportunity for growth.
Yes.
And if we go through this and we notice where we might be appropriating, or whether it's intentional or whether it's through negligence or ignorance, right?
That is huge, that part right there, because sometimes we get so caught up on, I didn't mean to, you know, I didn't know. Well, now you know. It's okay. It's okay.
Yeah. And let's just move forward.
And I think that's, you know, now my therapist lens is activated, but I do think that's when some of our wounds and inner child stuff comes on. I don't want to be wrong. It's kind of a shrinking or sometimes a puffing up. You know, I don't need to be told that I'm wrong or that, you know, that my good intentions have failed. And I want to, you know, hone in on this. Hopefully everyone's, maybe come across this by now, but the difference between intention and impact. You can have the best of intentions. That's great. That, you know, to me, that's an ego attachment to good, being good, right? My intentions are good, so therefore it's always going to be defended. That's a very ego-based versus being able to drop into the heart-centered space of impact.
Yeah.
How did that land? And that doesn't mean you have to take responsibility for someone else's emotions, but particularly around these areas and these topics, that's why things are nuanced. We're human beings. There's not a black or white, right or wrong way of being. So around, we can say racially charged topics, things around cultural lineage, just see if you can tap into that place of maybe hyper empathy and knowing that you might not be getting scolded. You didn't do anything wrong, but the impact was not congruent with your intention, and someone's trying to share that.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And really feeling too how it lands, right? How does it land in the body? It's not likely a mental process. There may be some mental stuff around it, but there's a lot here about allowing it to land and noticing how it lands, noticing the discomfort or the comfort, and like you said, getting curious around that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jay, for taking this time to share your thoughts and your beliefs and your experience with us.
Thank you for having me. This was a great conversation. I'm so glad that we did it. There was a part of me that was like, oh my goodness, I just can't. But we gave it some time, and I think it's perfect timing. And thanks for leaning into all that you are, Janet, and allowing yourself to be vulnerable and open as we continue to grow.
And thank you for doing everything that you do. It's so appreciated. You're such a light, and I just look forward to so much continued goodness with you.
Thank you so much. Yes, Jill, the recommendations I sent it to the private chat, Janet. I think maybe it's there. Sorry, I couldn't comment.
I can find it.
Do you see it?
Yep, I can.
Okay, great. Maybe we can copy that over.
Thanks, Jill, for pointing that out. I'm just going to copy and paste them into the comments. this is really a great platform when you figure it all out.
Yeah, it seems pretty easy. Yeah, so the first resource is The Body is Not an Apology. And that is a really great website that has a lot of information. And the second one is Aorta, and they do a lot of anti-oppression work. I wonder if that one came through. Oh, there it is. Wonderful. Yeah. Aorta is an amazing organization. So here we are at the intersections of how to support, right? So you're trying to do more about this work. If you're able to donate to these organizations, this is kind of how you put your practice with real life, experiences, because people need resources. They need a livelihood to continue to put this information out here for us to consume. So that's how we build that, reciprocity.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that came up here. We need to financially support those who are educating.
Yeah.
Even if they're doing it through their social media platform, right?
Yep. Yeah.
So
great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us. And I'm sure we'll be doing future collabs.
All right, lady. Have a beautiful day. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.